Are we ready to go? I think maybe we are. Okay. Hi, everyone. How nice to have you here. It's really great to welcome everyone to our MD Reunion weekend. This is a special weekend, as you know. It's our bicentennial, as you see up here. And that's really a notable occasion. So we're so glad that you can come and be here with us as we get this whole thing started. I'm really pleased that today you're also going to get to meet, for many of you, I think the first time our president of the university, President Ellen Gramberg, who's with us to welcome you as well. And I can assure you that she's really been a fabulous addition to our campus for the last year and a half, and has been a wonderful supporter of our academic medicine program in particular. For those who don't know me, and I get there are probably a few in the room who don't, I'm Barbara Bass. I'm the current Dean and Vice President for Health Affairs of the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. I've been here for almost 5 years. 5 years will be my reunion in January, and it's really my immense honor to welcome you to this symposium, the first, of course, of a I don't know if we did one of these at the centennial or not, but certainly this is our first bicentennial symposium. And in a few minutes, I'm going to start the program with someone that many of you may know well, Professor Jeff Akman. But we have three really terrific speakers this afternoon that kind of highlight the space that our physicians and our graduates have occupied in academic medicine and healthcare writ large, which for those of you that are in the business know this is a pretty changing and interesting, challenging, exciting time in healthcare. So I hope you'll get some of that energy today from some of our speakers. So we start with Dr. Akman at 2:15, who, by the way, has spent a quarter of his he's been at GW for a quarter of that bicentennial period, so he knows a lot about us and has done even more talk, more research. And then we have Dr. Geeta Nayar, who's going to join us at 2:15 for a sort of a chat about her fascinating career and what we are now labeling as our GW Med Talks series. We've had one earlier in the year with Dr. John Perlin, the current President and CEO of the Joint Commission, for example. So we're bringing interesting characters from outside that have influence and inform us about the future of healthcare in a really fascinating way. And Dr. Nayar, as you're here, has expertise in the business of the role of medicine in other business structures, as well as particularly in AI, while still focusing on humanism in those processes. And then at the last production at 3:15, we have Dr. Lorenzo Norris, who's an associate professor of psychiatry, and also who's the individual who has really developed over these last 4 years, coming out of really difficult times, which I think we all lived through together, to develop our Office of Resiliency and Wellbeing at the GW School of Medicine and Health Sciences, which is actually converted into an incredible resource for our entire university. And he's got many other roles. You're going to love to meet him, and I know we'll have fun listening to his talk on hope and humanism, which is one of those things we try to preserve to ground us in our wonderful roles as physicians. But before we go too much further, I want to introduce President Ellen Gramberg to come in and tell us a few more thoughts about our school's bicentennial. I think it really will be important to understand how important a date this is. As you may know, the university writ large was founded in 1821. It took a few years, and actually medicine was one of the foundational charters for that. But it took us 3 years back then to get the actual MD program up and running. But it did launch with its first enrolled student in 1824 on the 30th of March. So I think it's really exciting that we have a chance to note that therefore makes us the 11th oldest medical school in the country, the oldest medical school in DC, and it means also that for 200 years we've been turning out people like you who have gone on to do great things as physicians, as scientists, and more recently vetted those repertoires of physician assistants, PT, OT, laboratory sciences, and of course PhD scientists, the biological scientist stars that we partner with so importantly in our translational science that propels all of us to improve the health of those that we serve so well. So we are really excited to get started with this, and we are really happy to have you here to celebrate with us. Each of these is structured in a way that we'll have our talk, and then you'll get a chance to ask some questions as well of our speaker. But first, let's start with President Gramberg, who is here to offer words of greeting to those present and those in the sky, and as she celebrates this moment with us as well. President Gramberg, are you back there? Thank you so much.
Well, hello and good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to join you today for this fantastic celebration and to welcome so many GW alumni, faculty, staff, students, and friends back to campus. I had the opportunity to attend some of the reunion last year, got a chance to meet some of you, and I knew that this next year was going to be a very, very special anniversary. So I'm delighted to be able to spend some time here with you this afternoon and then again this evening. For 200 years, it's a big number, for 200 years, ever since you were founded as the National Medical College in 1824, the GW School of Medicine and Health Sciences has been at the forefront of medical innovation and patient care. There's such a distinguished history here. There's Professor Albert Freeman Africanus King, who rushed to take care of President Lincoln when he was shot. There's Dr. Walter Reed, who joined our faculty in 1893. There is our successful treatment of President Ronald Reagan in 1981. And then more recently, there is the critical role that we played in testing the Moderna mRNA vaccine, saving countless lives. SMHS has consistently shaped the course of American medicine in a great number of ways. One of those are the amazing leaders that are the products of this university and this medical school. Just a couple of examples. The first Asian American U.S. Surgeon General, the first African American woman to serve as U.S. Army Surgeon General, and 3 Nobel laureates. But perhaps most importantly, the medical school has educated thousands of medical professionals who have made a real difference in the lives of our fellow human beings here in the DMV region, across the country, and around the world. And it's always such a pleasure when I'm traveling and meeting with alumni groups. The medical alumni come out for those events, and I get a chance to get to know some of them. And so I have some sense of the reach that this school has had across the country. When I hear about these achievements, when I hear stories from alumni, when I hear about the remarkable work that's going on, when I read GW Today and see another story about a fascinating research project that's going on, I'm continually impressed by the depth and the breadth that this school has and the impact across an enormous array of fields within medicine. When I discuss what makes GW so special, I talk about 3 things. I talk about our proximity to the nation's decision makers. I talk about our pursuit of impact. And I talk about the people that make up the university community. And when you put those together, I think these are our unfair advantages as an institution. And each one of these strengths is absolutely exemplified in SMHS. Dr. Bass has talked often about the school's 50% increase in research over the last 5 years. I mean, that is, any of you who are in academic medicine, you know what an extraordinary accomplishment that is. But I also want to point out that year over year, the increase was 17%. I mean, just an amazing accomplishment in an incredibly competitive funding environment. This kind of growth, it's not only impressive in and of itself, it firmly positions the medical school as one of the leading research enterprises within the George Washington University. What's also important is that you don't just generate research that goes on a shelf, hoping somebody else will figure out what to do with it. What makes GW in general and SMHS in particular particularly special is that we combine our strengths and our scholarship to impact patient care, to impact law and health policy, to impact medical education in ways that have an immediate impact on the lives of others. So just one example, this week I had the opportunity to tour the new cellular processing and manufacturing facility in Ross Hall. This state-of-the-art facility represents more than just a new space. It embodies our commitment to expanding access to cutting-edge medical treatments throughout our community. And when we had the ceremony to open it, Julie Bauman spoke very eloquently about the power of the treatment, but also the power of making it available to the poorest communities in the DC area. By bringing in-house the clinical requirements of our bone marrow transplant program and serving as a catalyst for future cell therapy research, the facility really shows how you can extend your impact far beyond our campus. You can reach more patients and you can have a meaningful impact on health equity, which I'm a medical sociologist by training, so I'm particularly fond of initiatives that promote health equity. The School of Medicine and Health Sciences and our broader academic medical enterprise are really a crown jewel at GW. The education of our medical students, the delivery of outstanding patient care, they are not ancillary activities that happen somewhere on the periphery of the university. They are fundamental to who we are and what we do. The medical students, the physicians, the alumni, you're right in the heartbeat of the university. And that's part of why it's so important to me to work very closely with Dean Bass to ensure that the medical school and the medical enterprise overall grows and thrives well into your third century. Now, to the MD alumni in the room, looking forward to spending time with you at this evening's reception, and I'm excited to meet more members of our outstanding GW medical community and to hear your stories. I also want to take a moment to thank the SMHS alumni who have given generously of their time, their talent, and their treasure to GW and to the School of Medicine and Health Sciences. Your efforts are not only appreciated, and believe me, they are really critical to our success. We cannot do what we do at the level we do it without the support of our alumni and without the donations that allow us to engage in some of the most innovative ways that we do. Your support also helps ensure that the next generation of medical professionals and researchers can carry forward the tradition that you all have established during your time with us. So again, I want to welcome you all home to GW. I thank you so much for coming back to campus, for spending some time with us. I'm now going to turn the program back over to Dean Bass, who is going to introduce our first speaker. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you very much, President Gramberg. And you know, it's interesting, she is a medical sociologist by training, and I think also, like many of our students today, have experiences beyond just the academy, and quote, I'm going to say just medicine. And I think that there's her earlier experience in technology in the early days of marketing and development of cellular telephone networks way back when, and then a return to the academy really informs her very practical, grounded, effective leadership that we have here at the university under her leadership. So let's move on, though. It means now that we get to have our first speaker, someone who I bet is known to many of you at some point of some touch point, perhaps over his almost 50 years that he spent here at GW. But that, of course, is Dr. Jeff Akman, who's going to deliver the Elizabeth Webb Wilson Lecture for us this year. Dr. Akman is once again, he did this once about 15 years ago, too, is serving as a professor and the Leon M. Yochelson Chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health. Prior to that appointment, way back when, he served for a period of 11 years as my predecessor, as the Dean of the School of Medicine and Health Sciences and the Vice President for Health Affairs from 2011 to 2020. During his incredible leadership at that time, the school saw significant expansion of its diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, expansion of the biomedical and health sciences research enterprise, and the creation at that time of the young footprint for a GW Cancer Center, which you'll hear tomorrow in the State of the School program, has really blossomed into a destination-worthy, research-driven cancer center. He also saw incredible growth in innovative educational programs for our MD programs in particular, but also for our other health sciences programs, established some terrific faculty development programs which are so critical to the excellence of the education mission we deliver. His extensive service in the community and professional organizations have included his work on President Barack Obama's Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS, as president of the National Lesbian Health Association on the Mayor of District of Columbia's Commission on HIV/AIDS, and as president of the Washington Psychiatric Society. He's a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and member of the American College of Psychiatrists. Dr. Akman is widely recognized as a leading psychiatrist regionally and nationally. He's been honored on multiple occasions for his efforts in clinical care, medical education, community service, and for his service to George Washington University. He's a perfect person to offer this historical perspective, which we haven't done, at least since I've been here, this broad retrospective of our 200 years. He is not only a leader in the school, he's a graduate of our George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. He completed his residency in psychiatry here as well, and joined the psychiatry faculty in 1985 when he completed that training. So he is well known to many. With that, I think it's time, Dr. Akman, for you to come on out here and tell us about our school.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I was just looking across the audience, and it's good to see some fellow students or students of mine and colleagues and alumni, many of whom I've known through the years as a faculty member, as dean. And this history is wonderful, and I'm so happy to talk about it. I just wanted to, welcome all of you back. The classes that are here, many of you knew me as your psychiatry teacher, your human sexuality faculty member, the clerkship director, an assistant dean, et cetera. So it's great to welcome you back. I particularly want to acknowledge the 25th year reunion class of '99, and then, of course, all of the members who are here celebrating their 50th, 55, and 60 years, and any other graduates. So congratulations to all of you. It's great to have you back. For those of you who don't know, the medical school was on H Street before it was in Ross Hall, before it was in Foggy Bottom. We'll talk a little bit about that in terms of the history. But one of the things that would be good is I'm sort of trying to engage you guys in a little bit of the history, because the history is your history too, is to get some of your own memories, if we can maybe hear some of them as I'm giving the talk, because I at least want to make the history relevant. But we're going to start with my history, just briefly. This was me in graduation, 1981, to the class of '79. You were my colleagues, and many of you taught me as residents, for those of you who stayed here. And so to you, welcome back. The sad thing is just watching my photos through the years here and watching my hair lose my hair, gain weight, all of that. But a lot of you knew me this way. I was in the dean's office for 10 years, an assistant dean, and it was also during this time that I did a lot of teaching psychiatry, the first year behavioral sciences course, the second year psychopathology course, the clerkship, the second year human sexuality course. So I suspect that if you were here anytime during the 80s, 90s, and even into 2000, I probably taught you, right? So, and I know some of you definitely have stories about the human sexuality course. I know that. I have stories about when I was a student, and then when I came in to teach this course, the former teacher was Benny Waxman. He was an OBGYN professor, and he taught the course for years, and then I came in and taught the course. And I looked for his videos to teach, and they were so wrong for a medical student audience. He had the belief that you would desensitize people in like an hour lecture around sexuality. And the videos is, was anybody in Benny Waxman's human sexuality course? Right. You've never been the same. I know. Right. There was so much anxiety in the class. We were all so filled with anxiety by all of these. There were times, and I don't know if you remember, but the AV tech at the time, who'd been around for a very long time, was really put to the test because Dr. Waxman would have 3 videos going simultaneously, right? And in those days, it was Super 8, you had the projectors, 3 at a time. I came in to run the course, and I was like, this is just not me. I can't do this. It's too, so I totally changed the course, and it was never the same. But this was me as dean, and I have to say, there were a few great moments as dean. One was always graduation for sure, welcoming the new students, match day, those are all highlights. But I always loved meeting with the alumni. And it was really President Knapp who preceded President Granberg by, I think, several years. But President Knapp used to say, the most important thing we do as a university is generate alumni. Because you take what we teach you, and then you go out and make a difference in your communities or in your own practices or your own research, if you're in academia, in advancing knowledge, et cetera. And there's a lot to be said for that real multiplier effect. So I always loved meeting with the alumni to hear what you're doing and learn from you. As mentioned, and Dr. Granberg gave some of the history already, but it was George Washington's last will that ultimately led to the creation of this university. His last will in 1799. I'm sorry, I thought I had turned my phone off. Okay, which led to the Congress, chartering the school in 1821 as Columbian College. And then the med school, which was the Department of Medicine, was founded by the Board of Trustees in 1824 as the Department of Medicine, but it was really in 1825 when the doors opened. It was founded in 24, the doors opened in 25, and those were the first lectures, and these were the first courses. Looks exactly like we teach today, right? Theory and practice of physics, materia medica, and I was like, where's psychiatry? Where is psychiatry? Anyway, psychiatry didn't come into the picture for a very long time because the field of psychiatry was really developing at the time that GW Medical School was developing. So, but there's a lot that's not up here that came online later on. But we were the first medical school in DC, and we were actually, at the time we were created, we were the 17th medical school. But now we're the 11th because several of those early medical schools never made it. They financially, or even after Flexner, they were shut down. So we're now the 11th, and that'll probably be the case for a long time, I hope. The history really in DC is also so interesting because the government was, starting to grow, the federal government, and DC had built a hospital for the poor and the insane, as it was called in those days. But then it very quickly became the Washington Infirmary, and that was in 1844. And when it became the Washington Infirmary, ultimately, and soon thereafter, as the only medical school in town, we started sending students there and our professors. So it was the first general hospital in the district, but also one of the first teaching hospitals in the country as a result. Georgetown Medical School was founded after the Civil War, Howard later than that. So for really that whole period up through the Civil War, we were the only medical school in town, which is relevant when you hear about the Lincoln assassination and why we were so prominent. The Army had physicians because the Army was very present in DC, especially during the Civil War, but it was really the GW docs who were on the scene. So that's the infirmary, and on the right is now that same building during the Civil War. So we're moving into the Civil War. A lot of docs from GW were both on the Confederacy side as well as the Union side. And in fact, our faculty probably was more aligned with the Confederacy in those days. One of our faculty members was Jefferson Davis's Dr. A.Y. Garnett, and then Robert Stone, who was a former dean of the medical school. He was Abraham Lincoln's personal physician. But the building burned down. Right at the beginning of the Civil War, the infirmary burned down, which led GW, which in those days was called the National Medical College, to have to find other space to build a hospital, which it did, primarily over on 13th and H and some of the area over there, probably what we would now call Penn Quarter, Judiciary Square, parts of Washington. But then, of course, Lincoln was assassinated, and this is a picture, a painting of Lincoln on the bed at the Peterson House, which was a home across the street from Ford's Theater on 10th Street. And when Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth, the physicians, many of them had to jump in Ford's Theater, had to jump from the orchestra up into the box. So they were actually helped up to get into the box to attend to Lincoln. And there were several physicians. Well, actually, one was one of our medical students who actually joined that group. And as was mentioned, one was Albert Freeman Africanus King, who ultimately was a former dean and also an OBGYN. And he was one of the physicians who attended. I think there were like 3 physicians who attended Lincoln in the box. And then a group of them carried him across the street. It was raining that night in Ford's Theater. They were there to see a comedy called Our American Cousin. And the story is that John Wilkes Booth was in the theater ahead of time, totally cased it out, knew exactly when the most sort of uproarious laugh line would occur. And when that happened is when he shot Lincoln so that people wouldn't hear the gunshot. And he had actually barricaded the door of the box where Lincoln was sitting. So when he got in, then nobody could get in after him. So he shot him. People couldn't get in through the back, so people got in over the balcony, and then they attended to him, took him across the street to the Peterson House. More physicians arrived, including 2 other GW physicians. One was his personal physician, which was Robert King Stone, and then John May, who was a surgeon, who also attended. At that time, and you'll see there's several, Lincoln was so tall, he couldn't fit on the bed, so they had him laying diagonally on the bed. And they knew right away that there was a mortal wound, and throughout the entire period, they were, evacuating the clot and sticking their finger in. But it was Stone who really got his finger all the way in and felt the bullet and they knew from the very beginning, but it was sort of his decision to essentially stop any attempts. But they did try to ventilate him as per 1860-some guidelines, and obviously he didn't make it. But that wasn't the end of GW doctors' role in the assassination, as GW docs continued to be involved in the autopsy, as well as in attending to John Wilkes Booth. And ultimately, it was Frederick May who identified the body of John Wilkes Booth. So our docs were very involved in this very interesting, important period of history. And obviously, it wasn't the last time that our docs would be treating a president after an assassination attempt. Thankfully, the second time we did a lot better. But obviously no one's blaming us for Lincoln's demise. But these are class photos from this is the one on the left is from 1883. The one on the right is from 1912. Yeah, lots of women in those photos, aren't there? Yeah. Um, and it was in 1873 that Columbian College became Columbian University. The National Medical College, which we had been called, becomes the Columbian University Medical School. And then in 1880, Columbian University Medical School instituted what had been previous to that a 2-year curriculum, became a 3-year curriculum, and started expanding the curricula. And it really wasn't until later on in the 1890s that it became a 4-year curriculum. But along the way, GW was breaking barriers around diversity, and this is Clara Bliss Hines, who was the first woman to graduate from GW's medical school. This was 1887, and she was actually admitted with 3 other women, Ellen Cathcart, Sarah Schul, and Alice J. White. And it's interesting because when they graduated, there wasn't a place for women to train, to do their residency. So they actually created a clinic, a women's clinic in Washington, D.C., where they could get their post-medical school training. Very, really amazing women. And our women's faculty group in the medical school is the Clara Bliss Hines Society. So women faculty, basic science, health science, as well as medical, can join the Clara Bliss Hines Society. So it was a 4-year degree in the 1890s, 1894. One of the things about, as Dr. Gramberg had mentioned, is the history of research and at GW. And one of the threads that's so interesting when you look at research and our role in public health as a medical school has been around infectious diseases. This is Walter Reed, and Walter Reed was on faculty, and this is 1893. He was professor of bacteriology. He confirmed that yellow fever was in fact transmitted by a mosquito. At the time, it was thought that it was person-to-person contact, but it was Walter Reed who made that discovery. And one of the threads that as you think about GW research, medical research, is around infectious diseases, and whether it's yellow fever, or as you'll see later, typhoid, or whether it's about HIV/AIDS or COVID, this thread really does. And historically, we've had an incredibly strong department now of microbiology, but back then was bacteriology. When you think about some of those researchers, including, we'll talk about that as I go on. So 1904 is when we became GW. 1904 was an act of Congress. Columbian University is named George Washington University, and the medical school becomes George Washington University Medical School and Hospital. The hospital was part of the name, right? So at that time, the hospital, again, was over in Judiciary Square, what is now Penn Quarter, that area over there, 8th Street, 13th Street, until, I forgot, there's a slide here before that. So this I was talking about bacteriology. Frederick Russell, he perfected the typhoid vaccine, and then he led the vaccination program to immunize the U.S. Army. Again, the echoes and the foreshadowing of our role in pandemics later on, HIV/AIDS, COVID, is really, really interesting. And Frederick Russell was a major figure here in the early 1900s. Anyway, so the hospital moves from Judiciary Square, Penn Quarter area, and that's Pennsylvania Avenue and 23rd Street. So you've got 23rd Street diagonally on the right, Pennsylvania Avenue at the bottom of the screen, and that's the GW Hospital, built in 1948. At the time of its dedication, it was the largest private building in Washington, D.C. And then there would be add-ons to it. For those of you who trained in this hospital, like me, how many of you trained in this hospital? Yeah, a lot of folks here. Okay, so then there was the pavilion that was added on for the emergency room at Washington Circle. Obviously, I think when we trained, there weren't cars parked right in front on 23rd Street. That had already disappeared. But really, some of those buildings now around it continue to be GW buildings. I don't know if GW owned those buildings back then, but dormitories, I believe that might be the Burns building to the left. But those two buildings further back, I think one is Onassis Hall. So just interesting. So that was 1948. So President Granberg mentioned that some of our history really has to do with Nobel Prize winners. And this was really a really remarkable professor, Vincent de Vignod, who was professor of biochemistry. And he won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for his research on sulfa compounds and being the first to synthesize oxytocin. Now, I don't think he knew at that time the story that oxytocin would tell through the years, but it's now become a very, very important molecule for us to understand as it relates to connectedness and emotion, attachment, as well as, obviously, for those folks in OBGYN and the role that oxytocin plays in lactation, et cetera. So he's a major figure, and there's a plaque to him in front of the gate right at Ross Hall. So when you come through the courtyard, you'll see one of the plaques is in memory, in honor of Dr. de Vignod. Talked about diversity, and this is Dr. Jackson, James Jackson, who became the first black student to earn his medical degree from GW. And that wasn't until 1959. But it was a landmark, obviously, for us. GW, I'm not going to go into it, but there was obviously some history of segregation and, wasn't always on the right side of social issues through the years. But, Dr. Jackson was a groundbreaker, and he went on to really become a significant member of the OBGYN community, nationally recognized obstetrician gynecologist. Well, how many of you learned in H Street? How many of you were students in H Street? Okay. Who are the 3 Bs? Anybody? The 3 Bs. Dean Blodorn, Catherine Breen, and Bowie. Who was Bowie? Tell me who was Bowie. Does anybody remember who Bowie was? He was the janitor. But he was a key person in the culture of H Street. He would not let the medical students use the elevator, right? He would take the bodies up and down. He would be very responsible for bringing the cadavers up to the lab. And those 3 essentially ran H Street. Dean Walter Blodorn, who now his name is linked to the dean of the medical school because the deanship is endowed in Walter Blodorn's name. And he was dean for maybe 40 years or something. He was really a remarkable figure in the transition of the school from sort of the early days of the 1900s into the 1960s. I think he was probably dean into the 1960s. So Walter Blodorn was a key person. Catherine Breen was the secretary. She actually ran the place. She ran the medical school. So anyway, there's the lecture hall on the right. There's the biochemistry lab on the left. And it was all around that time as H Street was the university leadership was thinking about what to do with H Street and how to build this larger academic medical center, that the partnership was made in 1968 between GW and Children's. Now, Children's faculty, Children's physicians before 1968, many of them were teaching GW medical students and had faculty appointments. So the relationship between GW and Children's goes back prior to 1968, significantly before that. For example, I know that a member of the psychiatry faculty was one of the leaders in child and adolescent psychiatry, dating back to the 1940s. It was a doc named Dr. Reginald Lurie who went on to make fundamental discoveries and advance the field in early infant and child psychiatry. But it was that's 1968, and that really has fundamentally had an impact on our learners and the identity of the school. So many of you know, for example, at GW Hospital or in our outpatient departments, we only see adults, except for the neonates that are born on the OB service. We only see adults, and it's because our agreement has the children going and youth going to Children's National. So that's when that started. All of the faculty now at Children's, for the most part, which is a very large faculty, have full-time faculty appointments from GW. And they're a really remarkable group, advancing knowledge, doing amazing work, and historically a great place for our medical students to learn, a great place. The Burns Building, which is our outpatient facility, one of our outpatient facilities, it was in 1969 that it was dedicated as a building. It was previously an apartment building on the corner of Pennsylvania and 23rd, and across from the hospital, directly across the street from the hospital at that time. And then in 1988, the I Street Ambulatory Care Center was added. Now this is one of my favorite people in the history of GW. This is Dr. Julius Axelrod, and the reason he's one of my favorites is because he made fundamental discoveries that changed the field of psychiatry. And his work, he got his PhD here, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1970 for his work in release and reuptake of catecholamine neurotransmitters. It's helped us understand the mechanisms for antidepressants. It's helped us understand why cocaine does what it does. But does anybody know what else he discovered that's not related to that? Something you take very, very commonly for like a headache. He discovered acetaminophen. He didn't win the Nobel Prize for discovering this acetaminophen, but he discovered acetaminophen. And I don't think he had the patent. So, but Julie Axelrod spent most of his time at NIH. He did most of his research at NIH, and his colleagues would say to him, Julie, no one's going to take you seriously because you don't have a PhD. I think, in fact, he might have discovered acetaminophen, and he didn't have a PhD. He was just this amazing researcher. And so I don't know if there was some sort of communication that took place with the dean of the medical school at that time and with Dr. Axelrod, and they brought him in, and he did coursework here, and he got his PhD here. But he had already been established as a significant researcher in the field. So I mentioned Dr. Davigno has his, the plaque in the I Street courtyard in front of the gates. The other person who does is Dr. Axelrod. So Julie Axelrod is remembered in a plaque. There was a third Nobel Prize winner on our faculty. I don't have a slide for him, and that was Dr. Farid Murad. He actually joined us when I was dean in I think 2012 or something. And he won the Nobel Prize for discovering nitrous oxide and how nitrous oxide could be effective and useful. And what came out of his work? Does anybody know? Nitrous oxide? Sildenafil, right? Viagra. So his work led to the discovery of Viagra. He didn't have the patent for that either. But his work has also helped unlock mysteries much beyond the effect of sildenafil on the reproductive urologic tract. Okay, so in the 70s, the early 70s, GW decided to close H Street and move to a new facility in Foggy Bottom, a catty corner across 23rd Street from the hospital. The metro wasn't built at that time when it came. It was being built, actually. When I arrived as a medical student in 1977, it was still actually under construction. The Foggy Bottom stop was about to open, but it hadn't opened when I arrived. But there was a lot of construction along that 23rd Street, I Street area as they were digging the tunnels. This has now been the home of the medical school really since the 1970s. Are there folks here who were sort of part of that first wave of students who came to what years were you first-year students? 75. Yeah, so you would have been some of the first students to come to Ross Hall. Yeah. It was Skip Williams who, when he was dean, who added that stairway in the front corner there. When I came in, the students thought that I had created that. They used to call it Dean Akman Stairway to Heaven. And I said, no, actually, I didn't. I'm not going to take credit for that. But the reason it was built was because we were in violation of code issues, and that's why they had to build that. Because the building, when it was built and how the codes evolved through the years, it was in violation of code, so that was added. One of the things that I think all of you would agree is that there's been this amazing history of great educators here through the years. And I cannot name them all, just like I can't name all the great researchers through the years, but very few would deny that Frank Miller, professor of pathology, wasn't one of the great faculty members and educators here. Anybody who had Frank Miller as a teacher? Yeah. And I think Frank's humanity, he would bring Shakespeare into his lectures. He was really such ahead of his time in terms of medical humanities and how he incorporated that into pathology. But probably, the best thing about Frank Miller was his level of organization and his care for the students. He really wanted to make sure everybody knew pathology. And there's this one story of Frank Miller. He was acting dean at some point, and it was around the Vietnam War. And one of his students had was having to go into the military. And really he didn't want to. And Frank somehow worked with this student in a way that the student could defer his military service until after medical school, which was a huge deal for that time. I think Frank he was not a supporter of the Vietnam War. And so he worked with students who didn't want to serve at that time. But Frank was, there are a couple of faculty members who go down in the history of the school as the top educators, and there's no question Frank Miller's one. So now, 1973, we become the GW School of Medicine, Health Sciences. But now we currently have 4 basic sciences departments, 15 clinical departments, including the Department of Pediatrics, which is at Children's, and 4 health sciences departments, all of which have grown tremendously through the years. And now the school grants an MD, multiple PhDs, Doctor of Physical Therapy, the Doctorate in Occupational Therapy, Doctor of Health Science, a slew of master's degrees, a bachelor's degree, a post-baccalaureate certificate, and other certificates. So we really expanded from those, 4 courses or 5 courses that were taught in 1824. And many of you just sort of beginning to incorporate some of the other leaders through the years. Remember Tom Bowles? How many of you had Tom Bowles as your dean? So Tom Bowles was a thoracic surgeon, and he was executive dean, and he really had a stature and an engagement with the students that I think all of us remember Tom is a great figure here in the medical school. He went on to become head of the National Board of Medical Examiners, but his claim to fame, Elise, what's his claim to fame? Julie Louise Dreyfus is his daughter. Okay? That's actually his claim to fame. But Tom was a real gentleman and was actually continuing to serve on medical school committees into his 90s, right? And had a wisdom that he imparted that was second to none. Bob Keimowitz was a dean in the 80s and 90s. How many of you had your admissions, certificate signed by Bob Keimowitz, right? Bob was an internist. Under his leadership, the medical school curriculum really changed. He made some significant changes, or led significant changes, including POM. And it would be remiss of me not to put Rhonda Goldberg up. Rhonda joined us in the 1970s and has been an important person in the dean's office, really continues to serve as associate dean. Student affairs, mentorship, advisor, mother, big sister, and really definitely an important figure in the history of the school. How many were taught by Glenn Walker? Glenn Walker, another one of the best teachers in the history of the school. Biochemistry. Anybody have a quick memory of Glenn Walker as a teacher? What? The Krebs cycle. Oh, right? But the thing that went along with the Krebs cycle, or like Hollis or whatever, is he drawn out on the chalkboard, right? So it was always about the chalkboard with Glenn. And then when PowerPoint came, he was never the same. It was like, Glenn, nobody knows what a chalkboard is anymore. But Glenn Walker was, again, one of these, amazing professors. 1981, I mentioned, obviously, we all know that this was the second president who was, treated by us after an assassination attempt. These are some of this was the headline from the New York Times. There he is on the left going into the Washington Hilton, arm up. That's when the bullet hit him under his arm. And there he is coming out of the hospital on the right, and then getting an honorary degree from President Trachtenberg. But I talked about earlier about great clinicians who've come through GW and who've been on the faculty and who we've trained. And these were 4 of the many docs who attended to President Reagan, as well as to his press secretary, Jim Brady, and others. So on the left is Arthur Cobreen, who was the neurosurgeon who saved James Brady's life. And then Theodore Newt Sangaris, really one of the great surgeons, great teachers. Talk about a great clinical educator. There were really none better than Newt Sangaris. And including he was chair. In the middle is Dennis O'Leary. He was the clinical affairs dean at the time and became the spokesperson that really held the nation's hands during this whole period of time when Reagan was really, it was touch and go. That bullet had lodged like an inch from his heart and his aorta, missed his heart and his aorta. And it was Dennis O'Leary who really, kept the nation, held the nation's hand, as it were. Joe Giordano, who became the chair of the department, and Ben Aaron, who was the thoracic surgeon and the lead surgeon on the case. So an amazing history of great clinicians, especially in the surgery department. Then had to throw her in. This was me, and the point here is around advocacy. One of the other things that we do amazingly well, and President Granberg talked about our location, and our location has lent itself to advocacy on so many different levels. So this was when I was working a lot in the community around HIV/AIDS. We were dedicating the Elizabeth Taylor Medical Center at Whitman Walker. I happened to be chairman of the board of Whitman Walker at that time. and she was there. Elizabeth Taylor came, and she was obviously very, very engaged in AIDS advocacy. But we were ground zero for HIV/AIDS in the entire Mid-Atlantic area. So everybody, was involved in HIV/AIDS, and it was Gary Simon, recently retired head of our infectious diseases division, that identified the first case of AIDS. But we had more AIDS cases than any other hospital. We were really generating a lot of important scholarship and research. And I was one of this first wave of psychiatrists to create the field of HIV psychiatry. And it really was so much about our location. Alan Weingold was executive vice president, was vice president for medical affairs and dean, and it was under Al, and one of the greatest OBGYNs ever, an amazing clinician, amazing educator, wrote the textbooks. Under Alan's leadership, GW sold our hospital to Universal Health Services and spun off the Medical Faculty Associates into a separate nonprofit. He led that under the leadership, obviously, of the university and the board of trustees, but he was the point for the medical center at the time. Followed by Skip Williams. Skip was the first black vice president of the university and the first black dean of the school. Skip held many positions. He was also provost of the university and was medical director of GW Hospital. Skip had a huge impact on the medical center, and in particular began some of the earliest efforts around diversity, equity, inclusion. But under Skip, he had oversight at that time. His position included the School of Public Health, the School of Nursing, was all under the leadership of the Vice President for Medical Affairs. And it wasn't, I followed Skip in that role, and my job was actually to spin off the School of Public Health and the School of Nursing so that they were not under this administrative umbrella called the GW Medical Center. So I was the one who put the GW Medical Center to bed. Okay, another one of the greatest teachers in the history of GW, Jim Scott, professor of emergency medicine, probably without a doubt has won more golden apples than any other faculty member. Jim continues to teach. Jim was dean. How many of you had Jim as your dean or faculty? Were taught by Jim? Yeah, Jim was and continues to be an amazing teacher. Teaches in the emergency room. He's and Jim is beloved. The new hospital was built in 2002. The deal was made in 1997. Then the hospital in 2002. And then they tore down the old hospital and built a Whole Foods and an apartment building, right? So that's where the old hospital was. In 2014, we built the class center, the Clinical Learning and Simulation Center, in Ross Hall. And there's really been a number of major renovations in Ross Hall. For those of you who haven't been to Ross Hall since you graduated, the labs, these modern labs, the Clinical Learning Center, President Grammer talked about the cell therapy production facility. It's really remarkable what this ugly building contains, right? I mean, it really is remarkable. If you can sort of get beyond the ugly, brutalist architecture and get inside, you'll see some pretty amazing stuff. And then there's been a series of changes in the curriculum, transformation of the curriculum. And this is one. In 2014, we instituted what was called, at the time, clinical public health curriculum to sort of marry our clinical as well as public health identities, especially given our location, and whether it was about health policy or community health. And early on, our students used to go to the White House and give presentations to the White House leadership on how physicians can create an AIDS-free generation. And that went on for several years until Donald Trump became president the first time, and then it ended. But we never got back in the White House, but what came out of that was that Tony Fauci teaches our medical students every year on HIV/AIDS. I don't know whether he's going to continue to do that after his bout of West Nile virus, but Tony Fauci comes every year to teach our medical students. Well, speaking of COVID, right, and I'm getting ready to wrap up. The pandemic hits. Dean Bass had the great fortune of stepping in right when the pandemic hit. I had the great wisdom of stepping down right before it hit. And nobody knew what Barbara Bass looked like for how long because of the mask, right? Right? It's like, okay, she's hidden. But we were such a central, again, on the left is the US COVID vaccine czar, again, our location. But on the right is Dr. David Demert, who's doing groundbreaking HIV vaccine work, COVID vaccine work, clinician, educator extraordinaire, and again, just part of the great history of our school around clinical translational research, and he's just amazing. Dr. Sadawi on the right told me he was coming to my lecture today, so I thought, okay. So there's some of the leadership of the school. Dr. Tony Sadawi on the right is the chairman of the Department of Surgery, recently elected as president-elect of the American College of Surgeons. That's just about a week or two ago. Congratulations, Tony. To the right, heading towards the left, Dr. Lorenzo Naris will be speaking later today, head of our Center of Resiliency and Wellbeing. In the front, Dr. Nancy Gaba, chair of OBGYN and a leader in her field, and has taught, she's been here since the 80s too, and has taught gazillions of medical students. Bill Borden, who was interim chair of medicine for years, and yours truly. And I just wanted to wrap up with a photo of the first woman dean of the School of Medicine in its 200 years, Dean Barbara Bass, a surgeon in her own right and a leader, and no longer has to wear a mask. So thank you very much. Sorry for running over. Oh, we do? Oh, okay. Well, we
Just
can
a
do.
minute or two. Do we have a hard stop? We're past it. That was fabulous, Jeff.
Thank you.
It was, as always, just,
you. A trip down memory lane.
A trip down memory lane, but a warm trip down memory lane,
Thank
and
you.
really an inspiring trip. So thank you
appreciate that.
so much
Thank
for
you.
that.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. So we actually are out of time for this one right now because we have to transition the stage up here. So I'd ask you that you step out for a couple of minutes and plan to be back in here at 2:15 for our next speaker, who will be Dr. Geeta Nayar, who will give us a really fascinating chat about her fascinating career in medicine. So thank you all very much. And Jeff, thank you. That was one of President Granberger. Thank you for being here as well.